Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us today for our webinar. Please let us know in the chat, where are you visiting us from? From which country are you from? Hello, Diogo from Portugal. Hello, Rui. Hello, Andre. Welcome, everyone. Sergio from Italy. Welcome. Hello, Rui. We appreciate your presence here today. We will give 2 more minutes so all the attendees join us. Thank you for being here today for the webinar 7 Root Causes, Crucial Mistakes Organizations Make and How They Kill Performance. So we will start with a small introduction while the rest of the attendees join us. Okay, thank you so much again for watching this webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the Experience Agile Week. The Experience Agile Week has 3 different events: the World Agility Forum that happens next 25th and 26th of September, Agile Human Factors on the 27th of September, and Experience Agile Conference on the 28th and 29th. In case you don't know these 3 conferences, I invite you to go to experienceagile.org and know more about each one of the programs that we have for you. And so this webinar, 7 Root Causes, it's the last webinar from a sequence of monthly webinars that we have been promoting since January. So because of the conference, we try to bring some of the most themes that are most wanted for the public. And today we have 2 special guests talking about crucial mistakes that organizations make and how these mistakes kill the performance. So during the webinar, you will be able to use Q&A in your Zoom window for questions. Feel free to write all the questions you have during the webinar. Our speakers will be answering the questions through all the moments of the webinar. You can also so you can send our questions during the webinar, and in case we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, don't worry, but because we will be able to answer them offline. So learn as much as you can and enjoy your learning moment. In case you have other questions related to the conference or any other subject related to the webinar, please feel free to write us to academy@agile21.com. So our speakers for today, first, Raymond Hoffman. Raymond is an independent management and organization designer. He's based in Switzerland. He works with senior management teams to unleash the full potential of people and organizations. Before becoming independent, Raymond had a long career in consulting and management, among others, as an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company and as the COO of Avaloq, a global leader in banking software. Raymond is also an active participant of the World Agility Forum movement. So we are very glad to have Raymond representing the group of speakers that attend World Agility Forum and that weekly and on a bi-weekly basis coordinate the World Agility Forum teams. Also, Michele Zanini with Gary Hamel. Michele is the co-author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller Humanocracy and the co-founder of the Management Lab, where they help forward-thinking organizations become more resilient, innovative, and engaging places to work. Before joining forces with Gary, Michele was an associate partner at McKinsey & Company and a leader in the firm's organization, strategy, and financial services practices. So we are very honored with both presences here today, Raymond and Michele, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience today. I would like to hand over the stage to you, Raymond and Michele, and wish you an amazing webinar all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. It's a true pleasure to be here. So let me ask, by way of introduction, how we're going to do this and what this is going to be about. Last year, during the first wave of lockdowns, I had some extra time, as many of us, I guess, to reflect on my more than 20 years of trying to help organizations just become better organizations. And as I mentally reviewed many of the projects I've been involved in, it struck me that we ended up at a relatively small number of underlying root causes that kind of prevented the organization from really fully tap into its potentials. No matter where we started with what kind of problem we started with, whether it's an engagement problem, a strategy execution problem, losing market share problem, really, or anything else, we always ended up with pretty much the same set of underlying causes. So I called them the 7 root causes and wrote a short ebook outlining what they are and how we might overcome them. So in today's webinar, I'm going to give a brief overview of what those 7 root causes are. And that will be the launch pad for our conversation with Michele about what all of us can do to eradicate these and potentially also other killers of performance in organizations. Of course, I have my own ideas, but I'm very curious to hear from Michele's experience also how the principles of humanocracy might help us, get rid of such root causes. For those of you who haven't read it yet, you need to get a copy of this very fantastic book, which of course, unfortunately, now you can't see because of the background, but now I think you can see it. So you have to get your hands on a copy of these. So again, Michele, thank you very much for joining us. I will be giving, as we said, a really short overview of the root causes, and then we get into the discussion of why they're there and what we can do to get rid of them.
Thank you for letting me in, Raymond. Look forward to it.
Great, excellent. And again, as Paula already said, feel free to fire off questions throughout, and we'll also have perhaps some dedicated question time at the very end set aside to capture any remaining unanswered questions. So let's get started. And let me start by sharing my screen here and make it big. All right, here we go. I suspect most of you are familiar with these kind of metrics. Engagement up at 15%, new services and products, 75% of them that are being introduced are commercially not successful. The 70% of change programs that fail to reach their objectives. And of course, a really devastating one, return on assets of US public companies actually on a steady decline since 1965, down to only 25% of what they were more than 50 years ago. So in other words, really, organizations make people miserable, they can't innovate, they can't change, and of course, performance drops as a consequence. But the worst part of the story really is that these numbers really haven't changed for decades. Despite all the engagement programs, the corporate incubators and innovation hubs, the digital transformation initiatives, really you name it, they haven't changed. So why is that? And I think my answer is because we tend to treat symptoms and leave the underlying root causes untouched. So let's look at what those root causes are that I found to be most prevalent in my own work. And these are really the crucial mistakes that organizations make that kill performance. First up, purpose is either meaningless or hypocritical. That means an organization says it pursues a noble goal, but in actual reality, it does something else. Next, everybody says, of course, that we're customer focused, but in actual reality, in most organizations, customers are actually not at the center of attention. Very close related to that one is many organizations are actually measuring the wrong things, and we'll see as we go along on why they're related. Then a really favorite of mine is that what's actually so casually called the leadership team or executive team is actually anything but a team in typical organizations. Then, of course, we all know that one. There's often quite a lot of confusion about what's truly important, what the priorities are in an organization. And a mistake that almost 9 out of 10 executives make that I work with initially is treating the organization as a machine instead of what it really is, namely a complex system. And last but not least, most organizations, even though they say how important innovation really is, they actually rely on luck rather than having a formal systematic mechanism to innovate and renew the organizations. Now, before we look at each of them in a little bit more detail, here's a word of caution. The word root cause is, of course, not quite right. Each of these, again, have underlying causes. What I try to do here is to find a useful level of abstraction where the cause is sort of specific enough to be actionable, yet generic enough to capture a lot of problems. Another disclaimer is that, of course, this is not a scientific study. It's just my own 2 cents based on 20 years of practical experience, both as an executive and as a consultant. And also please note that organizations are really complex, messy things. So it's no accident that some of the root causes may seem or maybe actually are sort of overlapping. And what they certainly are is they're systemically connected. By the way, shortly after I published the ebook, a friend sent me a link to a paper by Michael Beer and Russell Eisenstadt of Harvard Business School. The title was Silent Killers, Overcoming the Hidden Barriers to Organizational Fitness. In it, they list 6 silent killers. Similarities to the 7 root causes I found stunning. But what's even more stunning is that the paper was published in 1999, more than 20 years ago. So surely we still have an awful lot of work to do. But let's now have a brief look at some of the root causes in more detail. Given the time we have, this is really more going to be something of a jet tour, but I still hope you find that overview somewhat useful. First, purpose being meaningless or hypocritical. I mean, we all know, we all laugh at those kind of abstract, egocentric, jargon-loaded corporate purpose statements like we are the world's premier provider of banking services, or we disrupt education through the cutting use of AI, all this type of stuff that's actually really meaningless. More subtle, though, is the kind of hypocritical purpose I was referring to. That might be something that's actually meaningful and even well-defined. I once worked with a pioneer in sustainable asset management, and their purpose was to advance sustainability through financial markets. What they really meant was that through their investment funds, they would try to channel more money, more resources to kind of organizations that would actually, work on the cause and actually make a difference in the world. But unfortunately, the way they actually measured and rewarded success was no different from any other asset manager in the world. They just looked at net new assets. So as long as assets kept coming in, you were good, no matter whether those investments actually made an objectively verifiable difference in the real world. And that's kind of really sad. And what this creates, of course, is confusion in an organization. There's a lack of direction. You can't really use your purpose to sort of, guide either strategic or even tactical decision making. And that then in turn leads to organizational overload, lots of initiatives that sort of fight over resources, maybe even politics, and ultimately that can very quickly lead to a confused, disengaged, worn out, or even cynical team. Next up on the list is customers that are actually not at the center of attention. So every organization, of course, says we're customer focused, but actually most organizations define themselves more through the products and services they offer. The actual customer's job to be done, including its richness of functional, emotional, and social component, isn't well understood. While most successful startups actually start with a kind of good understanding of what that job is, they quickly lose their understanding actually and focus on it as operations scale. And all of a sudden, figures like sales, profitability, market share, budgets, and so on begin to take center stage. And when that happens, organizations really begin to satisfy internal demand. They begin to serve the hierarchy. And with that, very quickly, their ability to really serve customers suffers. Shifts in customer preferences begin to become unnoticed, and so on and so forth. And of course, it typically frustrates the frontline team as it becomes more and more difficult to actually serve the real needs of customers that they observe on a daily basis, but find it more and more difficult to actually meet them and to change anything about them in their organization. And that again typically has impacts on engagement. Need to go a bit more quickly here. Measuring the wrong things. Again, I said that's closely related. That typically happens when management doesn't understand the work. And therefore, they create all sorts of measures that are actually disconnected from the actual work, like financial measures and efficiency measures. And this becomes really deadly when they then use these things to kind of come up with arbitrary targets that then definitely shift away the attention from the real work and instead onto actually just meeting the numbers. And we see that all the time when people start gaming the system, not because they want to, but because basically the system makes them to. Classic examples is call centers that measure performance by a number of hours, number of calls per hour. And you actually have, and there's tons of studies that show that, and I've seen that personally in engagements where actually people are dropping calls just before time runs out for the average call. Obviously, that leaves the customer furious, but you know what? The numbers are right. And of course, there's also all sorts of these kind of dysfunctional behaviors that we observe in organizations, and I'm sure many of you have seen those as well. Then again, one of my favorites, the top team is not a team. They don't work together as a team. They typically don't have real accountability for shared objectives. There's no common understanding and agreement on who needs to contribute what to be collectively successful. It's really sad. And most of these teams are really just a bunch of individuals who happen to have the same boss. They meet perhaps once per month for half a day, and then the meeting is actually a series of one-on-one conversations between the CEO and the individual executive team members. And the consequences, of course, are devastating. That's one of the main causes, I believe, of silos and politics in organizations. And of course, conflicts that are not solved at the top of the organization, they kind of just replicate and throughout the organization until collaboration at pretty much every level begins to collapse. And that's certainly not something any of us would call healthy. We're getting closer to wrapping up on all 7 of them. Confusion about what's important. Again, how it shows is people don't know what's expected of them, how they can know that they're actually doing a good job. There's conflicting objectives between departments because there's no common understanding of, again, who needs to contribute what to some sort of higher order goals. And I'm again and again, I'm surprised by how little transparency there is in organizations about goals, both vertically and horizontally. So people don't know what their peers' goals are. They don't know what their boss's goals are. And then you wonder, how there's kind of like chaos and the organization pulling into all sorts of different directions at the same time. Because in the absence of clarity, people will create their own meaning, define their own objectives, and even if they're well-intentioned, they will never work together just like that without some sort of a mechanism that's systematic to actually, align some of those things. And that has all sorts of, again, consequences in itself, like, again, wasteful resource allocation and so on and so forth. Then again, one of my favorites, treating the organization as a machine. We can see that in an overemphasis on planning and control, analysis, local optimization without understanding a system as a whole. And one of the main things really I see here is sort of an emphasis on fixing people. So when performance isn't right, the assumption is, something's wrong with the people. We need to train them, we need to upskill them, we need to give them more feedback, we need to have better performance management, all sorts of things. When in fact, probably it's the underlying system that drives performance. I mean, these people ignore what Deming taught us long ago, that 95% of performance of a system is actually explained by the system and not the people working in the system. And failure to understand that, of course, frustrates people and is an explanation for all sorts of things, like the failing change initiatives and the people who perceive to have a strategy execution problem when really what they just have a system in place that executes a different strategy, but they're not really aware of that. And finally, innovation relying on luck. Again, I have CEOs all over the world are lamenting the poor performance of innovation in their organizations, but actually themselves are spending almost no time on innovation. Then they confuse innovation with R&D and all these things. But again, most typically, they then have a system and organization in place that's totally geared towards execution. That is efficiency, perhaps scalability and growth, but certainly not innovation, which is a totally different category of problems. So even if you then again train people in sort of the latest methodologies, design thinking, you name it, lean startup, when they then come back into an organization, that makes it almost impossible to use those skills, to use these methodologies. That just kills people's morale. And on top of it, of course, makes it impossible to actually grow long-term. And it also has your margins eroded. And that's not stuff that we want. So here at this point, having gone through all 7 very briefly, I would like to just launch a little poll and just get a feeling for which of those that our audience actually observes in their own organizations, in their own work, whether it's working in an organization or working as a consultant with organizations. You can choose more than one. Give us an idea of which ones of those resonate and which ones maybe not, or if you have others that you see most often in organizations. So I'll give this a few more seconds to give a few more people a chance to vote.
And Raymond, while our audience answers the poll, we have a very good question from Diogo and in Q&A.
Yeah.
So you mentioned purpose starts through and meaningful, but you scale fast and aggressive. How do you maintain purpose in every new node or cluster of people effectively?
Mm-hmm. A really good question. I would say, I mean, again, there's no simple recipes for that, but I would say if you start off, with a true and meaningful purpose and you keep being true to that, even as you scale and you do that by making sure that whatever new node or cluster, as Diogo calls it, joins sort of the ecosystem or your organization, you make sure it's explicitly connected to that purpose. So again, one of the questions I see in top teams not working well together is there's no agreement on who's going to contribute what to some sort of higher order overall objectives. And if you're clear on those and you're clear on what every team, every node, every cluster is going to contribute, then that in itself gives that team directions and sort of its own, if you want, internal purpose to contribute to the bigger cause. It's not a difficult thing to do, but it takes quite a lot of discipline, and that's probably the quick answer I would give on that. Michele, do you see something else here that you would throw in?
Yeah, I think what matters is being quite selective when you hire people, and hiring for the right reasons. So more hiring for attitude than aptitude, making sure you have people with a set of orientations that are compatible with the purpose and the culture of the company, and then a lot of socialization. So when they come in, making sure that they feel like they're part of a real community, and there's a lot of time spent in building deep ties with people. I mean, good examples of that that we feature in the book are Southwest Airlines and Nucor. Southwest Airlines is like a low-cost airline. It's been around for a long time. They're basically like Ryanair, but like with way better customer service. They actually treat you really well, as opposed to like a luggage made out of flesh. And their purpose is to democratize the skies, and it's something that is deeply, deeply held by everyone there. And as I mentioned, they've oriented their selection process, the recruitment process, their onboarding process, and then everything around progression and in your career towards making sure that you're adhering to that purpose. And Nucor is similar. So you basically need to make sure all the management processes of the organization are consistent with that purpose and reinforce it every day when people come in, and then when they operate inside once they're in.
Thank you. I think that's a very important aspect that you raise here. It's also, obviously you mentioned the systems, the management processes that need to be aligned, but very well, it actually starts with very carefully hiring, who are actually the people you put in the system? What's their motivation to join this? Do they sign up to the calls? And. So I think that's a really, really important piece. So most people have voted. Let me quickly share the results here. I'm not sure if you can see that.
We can, Raymond. Yeah.
You can see it. Okay, very good. So customers not being at the center of attention, confusion about what's important. I think these are the two front runners we have here. Clear front runners, actually. So that's quite interesting. A few have other things. So if you can share those, maybe what those are in the chat, maybe that's something we can pick up as we continue in our conversation. So thank you for sharing that. Let me briefly wrap up the presentation and then really, launch into the conversation with Michele. So let me get back to the presentation, because there's one final thought really I would like to leave you with, and that's basically is that, and it comes back to a point I made earlier when I said these are not really root causes in a sense, and because again these things have underlying causes, and I believe that the main one is that we don't explicitly think about our management models. In contrast, business models are well understood as a unit of analysis and as a source of competitive advantage, and so on and so forth, and people spend an awful lot of time on those. But business models are an abstraction. They don't deliver any results. People and organizations do. Business models need organizations that actually deliver on their promises. And here's where management comes in. And the question is, how does management get a job done? What's even the work of management, and how do they do it in order to make an organization function and help an organization, tap into all its resources? And that, I think, is something we're not always very explicit on, and where a lot of the underlying, if you want, root or meta root cause, or mother of all root causes actually lies. So I do believe we need to think a lot more about how work actually works and how our organizations function, instead of focusing so much on our products and how to make them better, and by doing so taking it for granted that our organizations work just fine. When in effect, as Jason Fried puts it, your company better be your best product, since it's the product you use to make everything else you do. I really like that statement. And with that, I would like to close. Thank you for your attention, and go into the conversation here with our friend Michele. So Michele, thanks again for joining us on this one. And just as I asked the audience before in the poll, which of those would you see do you see in your work with organizations, or are there any others that you think are even more important?
Right. Well, thanks again, Raymond. So I couldn't vote because I guess I'm a panelist. I tried to,
Okay.
Zoom, but it wouldn't let me. But I would have voted for the organization as a machine. I mean, I see all of them, but that resonated with me the most because in a way, there are some common beliefs and assumptions about work and how value gets created and the role of human beings inside organizations that I think are at the root of everything, of all these other dysfunctions. So you know, I mean, in a way, that's our premise in the book, right? In Humanocracy, that it's those paradigmatic beliefs that are sometimes and most often unexplored, which shift your worldview and what you prioritize, right? So if you see ourselves as the sacred stewards of the earth and the natural environment, you know, we're going to take global warming quite seriously. If we instead think the earth is nothing more than a collection of resources we can squeeze, we're not going to care that much. And I think this is similar kind of approach one needs to take to people and organizations. And most organizations are founded and operate under the beliefs, right, that human beings are essentially these kind of commodities, these resources. They're factors of production, and we just use them to churn out products and services, right? And that, you know, we do that because the primary purpose of business is to maximize efficiency, right, and minimize variances, right, and minimizing waste, right, and that leads us to think about a certain set of organizational principles that allow us to do that. You know, things like, you know, stratification, you know, creating a hierarchy of control and command, right? Specialization, slotting people into narrow roles so they do their job and it's quite, you know, clear what they do and what they and so on. Where we standardize a lot of things, and then we weave these kind of principles into everything we do. And you know, we're not arguing that things like control, conformance, alignment are not important. They are, but there are two things that are problematic. One is you can take these priorities to the extreme. You know, you get to a point where control becomes toxic, or the quest for control becomes toxic and leads to a lot of the dysfunctions you talked about. And then the other thing is, you know, there are different ways to achieve control and discipline, right? So one way is through sort of kind of authoritarian power structures and a lot of centralization. But, you know, as we talk about in the book, there are other ways you do that. You can create a lot of transparency. You can, you know, around performance so that people who are not performing as well can learn from others, or you can create real incentives so that the right decisions are made without the need to break down performance metrics into a bunch of absurd KPIs that give people only a slot hole view of the problem, right? You can create peer-to-peer control as opposed to control coming from the top. But all of that, all these kinds of alternatives for managing organizations and then also managing change. And I'm so glad you mentioned that piece by Beer and Eisenstadt, you know, because they do talk about how, you know, our toxic beliefs are not just about how we manage operations day to day, organizations day to day, but how we change organizations. But, you know, we're not gonna get very far until we fundamentally challenge those assumptions, right? And I think that's the core of the problem. Like we're like, you know, we're like fish in the water. We don't realize that the water we're swimming in is not, you know, not conducive to to the best performance and to unleashing everyone's potential. And so, you know, to me, that's where you start, right? So instead of thinking about organizations, well, as people, as the instruments, right, the organizations use to produce products and services, you got to flip the relationship around. And, you know, the person is the agent and the organization is the instrument. And we're using the organization to better our lives as members and better the lives of the people we serve, right? And it sounds like a play of words, but it's actually really important, because if you put people at the center and then you really commit yourself to the challenge of creating organizations that elicit like the best that we can all give to the organization, then you end up with a completely different paradigm. and one in which, you know, the root causes that you mentioned are really, you know, not as relevant, right? Because you kind of address basically all of them, because you wire the organization differently and you conceive of individuals in the organization in a very different way. So anyway, so that's just my top line reaction. I realize it's a bit high level, and we can get into the specifics and provide some examples. But to me, that's in a very long answer to your question, Raymond, but to me, that's the key. Like, we need to shift the fundamental worldview about the relationship between individuals and the institution, and flip the order in terms of who's the resource and who's the agent and who's the principal here.
Right. I like that. I very much like that notion of sort of flipping the idea of, well, what's actually the instrument here, right? Is it people, or is it actually the organization for people, you know, to achieve something and to create at the end of the day, create value in the world. I really like that notion.
Right.
You wrote. Let's dig a little bit deeper. And I see the question from Andre here. We're going to get to that in a second, because it fits nicely into the flow here that I'm trying to get into. So bear with us, Andre. You wrote an interesting thread recently on Twitter about the lack of management innovation. And I was just curious whether, you know, how you see that lack of management innovation in recent years and decades, maybe how you see that connected to help us explain why so many of these problems actually still persist and are still so prevalent. Because it's not that in theory we don't know what, as you very well mentioned, the real core problem actually is, but why is this stuff still there? And does it have something to do with sort of a lack of management innovation, as you mentioned, or is that a completely different track?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, so the way both Gary and I came to this, like I wasn't, like, Gary was a strategy professor. I came from the world of strategy, but we backed into organization, into management, because we saw that as a fundamental limiting factor. So, you know, like, you want companies, you mentioned innovation, like you want companies to be innovative. And companies try to do that and try to create the incubator, or, you know, the lean startup program, or whatever. And then, you know, that often doesn't really stick, right? It doesn't really have a meaningful impact. And, you know, we tried that several times, you know, even in our consulting efforts, and, you know, got to the point of a dead end. And at some point we realized, you know, it's like teaching a dog to stand on its hind legs, like on two legs, right? And you can do that. Like, if you dangle a piece of prosciutto or some sweet in front of the dog will get up, right? You can do that. But what happens as soon as you turn away, you go do something else, the dog will go back on four legs, because, you know, and it's like, you know, it's really natural. The dog has a quadruped DNA, so the act of standing on two legs is pretty unnatural. And we feel the same thing is true in organizations. Organizations have this bureaucratic DNA. And so unless you change that, you do some DNA, you know, therapy, you're going to get that same kind of an approach, where you might call people scrum masters, or you might just have the incubator and whatever. But, you know, is that really going to have a lasting impact if you don't change some of the fundamental aspects of, you know, where accountability and power resides, how people are held accountable, how resources are allocated, and all those things, right? So that's really why we think that the management model and management innovation is important, right? Because when people think about management, they often they might think of it, like, people in management positions, but for us, management is a technology, right? It's a social technology. Like, it's the tools and methods we use to organize resources to productive ends, right? And in a way, it's what allows us to be so productive and wealthy in certain parts of privileged parts of the world today, right? We're able to churn out amazing products with a lot of discipline and control. And, you know, the methods, administrative methods, you know, the technology is important. Like, for creating an iPhone, the technology is important, but so is, you know, the ways you get people to work together in a productive way, right? So that's what management really is, right? And the management the management model is, people talk about, you had the business model there, business model canvas. You can think of something similar when it comes to the management model. And maybe if I can, it might be worth sharing if I can here, Raymond, a chart. Let's see if I can, so that I make this a little bit more concrete for people. Let's see if I can do this.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So if you think about, I don't know, can you see the big screen?
Yep.
All right. So the management model, in our view, includes, the core management systems that we find in most organizations. The planning, the HR practices, as well as the kind of architectural elements. The structure, the task design, the IT infrastructure, and so on. And so, we have inherited 20th century articulations and versions of the management model. And our contention is that these were well suited to the early part of the 20th century, but no longer suited to the 21st century. And we're like 20% into the 21st century. And, like if you ask the CEO, who managed, Unilever, Procter & Gamble in the 1970s to come back, they'd be surprised by certain things, surely the lightning fast information flows and so on, but a lot of the core elements of the organization, the fact that you have EVPs and SVPs and VPs and directors, the number of layers, the way performance is managed, the way budgeting is done, that's still like the same as it was 50, 60 years ago. And our contention is that unless you change those things and you rewire them fundamentally, you're not going to make much progress, and you're going to be stuck with the same killers that you've outlined, Raymond. So, and the companies we feature in the book, they all commit themselves based on this conviction that people need to be put at the center on reinventing these management processes in a way that unleashes human potential and makes them much more adaptable, innovative, and engaging. I'll just give a very quick example from Haier. Haier is the largest appliance maker in the world. Their CEO has long been a champion of this cause, which is pretty amazing if you think about it, of turning everyone in the company into a CEO and into a mini entrepreneur. And we're talking about a big company in China that have about 60,000 people working there. And, it's not just rhetoric, right? So he's made real changes so that, for instance, everyone in China is organized in a little startup inside of the company, about 10 to 12 people focused on different parts of the business. Some are in manufacturing, some are in design, some are in procurement, some are, kind of going to market with the product and the like. And they all come together with internal contracts, and they're all accountable for a P&L, right? So they don't have the kind of nonsensical metrics for performance that are just like one of 50 KPIs that is important, right? They have the P&L, which is the most fundamental metric of performance you can find, and they're all accountable for that. And they choose their own leaders, right? They're not appointed from the top down. So it's not like they don't have a hierarchy. They have some hierarchy, but the hierarchy is kind of reimagined and really actualized from the bottom up, and people are following people that are worth following. So that's what a leader really is. And the interesting thing, back to your point about the fact that we're stuck like in this like flat part of the innovation S-curve when it comes to management, is that Haier has been committing itself to this goal for many decades, and it's experimenting differently with different tweaks, right, to their management model, and has churned out new innovations and new ways of working that are fundamentally different from the norm. But they've really embraced that challenge and made it their core. Like, we need to evolve our management model and be really serious and systematic about it. Like, they didn't say, oh, that's cool what Spotify does. I'll do what Spotify does. I'll call my people, guilds, and I'll put them in guilds, tribes, and squads, whatever. No, they came up with their own method for doing this. Much like, if you think about it, like GE, which is it was one of the iconic companies of the 20th century, not so much in the 21st century, but they spearheaded a bunch of management innovation that really propelled her to success. They were the first ones to do industrial R&D at scale. They started and invented management training. They created the divisionalized structure. They were the ones who created strategic planning. And what's kind of depressing for me is that there are very few companies these days that are as curious and CEOs are as curious and as ambitious about changing their management model as they are about other things, which is why we're stuck.
Right. Which is a perfect segue. Thank you, Michele, for that. Into finally Andre's question, and he asks: do you believe new roles should exist to help on enterprise design, focusing more on the design of the organization versus actually the runtime of the organization? I have my view on that, but I'd be curious, and I have an idea of how you might answer that. But I'd be curious to hear: is it a matter of creating such new roles on enterprise design in the organization?
Well, so I think in general we should resist the temptation of just creating another CXO. I mean, that's often like, that's the instinct, right? Oh, we have a problem, let's just appoint someone in charge of that, as opposed to distributing that problem to everyone. That said, I do believe that, like at a Hire, for instance, and even in other companies, they have a team of people who are essentially the accelerators, the enablers of management experimentation inside of the firm. You know, they have like a little organizational lab, which isn't just like going off on its own, inventing new things that don't get implemented, but they facilitate and train people in thinking differently about how they solve organizational problems. And so having that as a capability, I think is pretty important. Whether you need to have a CXO for that, I'm not so sure. But you know, that's often lost, right? So and it's something you need to have internally. Yeah, you can call the McKinseys and Bains and BCGs of the world, but you know, you need to have this internally, because the process needs to be one that is very ongoing and very, very unique. And so I do think that having a capability to do management innovation is pretty fundamental. I mean, in fact, if you look at, there's the plaque for Crotonville, right, which is, you know, the GE where they had the corporate university. Again, it's one of the innovations for Crotonville. And I think the plaque says, you know, the Center for Management Development and Innovation, or something like that. And very few companies really think about it. And I think it'll be helpful to have more investment and focus on that. And that should be, to me, like a CEO should spend, you know, 10, maybe even 20% of his or her time on that, on being like the architect and enabling these kinds of changes to happen across the organization.
Yeah. Which gets us into the how a little bit. And Chandra is asking, we basically know how, right? We know what the pain points are. We have, at least for many of the things, we do have solutions. We know how to do better. But how do we actually do that? I mean, how do we even get started? I mean, you mentioned Hire, and obviously they were in a very good position in the sense that they had the CEO committed, you know, to that, you know, from the very start, and in for the long term, not some sort of a quick fix. But I mean, they've been working at this and evolving the model, you know, for decades now. But what if I'm not the CEO? What if I don't have decades? What if I'm somewhere in the middle and just can't take it anymore? Is there, what can I do to get started?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, it helps to have a CEO who's got your back, to be sure, or it also helps to be in a situation of life and death, or existential crisis that can jolt your organization into a new way of thinking. But absent that, it's more difficult, but it's not impossible. And like now more than ever, we're able to mobilize people and peers inside organizations in a way we couldn't, you know, 20 years ago. And so my suggestion is that you need to kind of do a couple of things. First, kind of think very experimentally. So if you think those features of the management model, the way you do planning, resource allocation, target setting, and so on, pick one within your area, right? You might have some control. I mean, if you're an entry-level person, obviously that may be a little tougher, but and then try to think about how might I experiment with this within my perimeter of action? What might I change in the way the team works? And if you do have a position of authority, how might I syndicate some of my prerogatives as a manager to people that work in my team? So start experimenting where you are with what you have. And then the other thing I think you should do is to go laterally before you go vertically. So you know, like I would try to create a coalition of like-minded peers who are invested and are passionate about solving the same problem you are. And now you can really aggregate that level of commitment and energy and thinking in a way you couldn't before, whether it's through, social media, enterprise social networking, or some other way of doing it. And, we have an example in the book of how the largest effort at improving patient care in the National Health Service in England, which is a massive organization with millions of people working in there, how that all started from like people in the middle, like a mid-level change, a very effective but not high-ranking practitioner who's very thoughtful about change and how change happens, and a few trainee doctors. And they created an online discussion and a set of pledges that people were contributing around, how do I do this? And, it just lit a fire, and they got hundreds of thousands of people to participate. And, had they gone to the CEO of the NHS, they would have gotten shut down in 3 seconds.
Right.
But since they didn't ask for permission and they just went laterally, at the end of the day, like when people in the powers that be in the NHS saw that this was happening, they got on board. Right. And this is great. I love it, but obviously the movie would have played out differently. So anyway, those are the kinds of things I would encourage people to think about. Think very experimentally, think about what you can do within your unit, your perimeter, and then try to catalyze a community of that goes lateral before it goes vertical.
Right, lateral, and then get allies, and then you can, once you have critical mass, you can sort of try to go vertical. Because again, if you're on your own, it's very easy for your boss to say no to one person, but maybe not as easy to say no to 100 persons, right? To kind of make the experience, and even may have some initial success stories on their side. Building on that, and that's probably going to be the last question already, because we need to be sort of conscious of time. We could go on probably for quite a bit more, but we need to be conscious of time. But the question Helder is asking is how to, sell the stakeholders on the idea of changing the management model, and when they're also focused on KPIs. And I think what that refers to is really, so if you have these people higher up in the hierarchy who are, fish swimming in the water, don't even know really, what's happening, or how it could be different in the first place. So how do we sell them? I'd like to sort of give a quick answer from my side, and then let you have sort of the final word. One thing I've seen work extremely well in my consulting practice, provided that the senior leaders would actually play a role in that, would actually go along with it, because some just wouldn't and would refuse. But the one thing is really cool to have leaders, shadow frontline employees just for a day or two, and just walk with them through their work for a day or two, and notice themselves, because you can give them as many rational arguments as you like. Unless they experience it, unless they see it, they won't believe it. So have them shadow your frontline people for a day or two and observe firsthand what kind of systemic barriers these people run into on a daily basis that prevent them from doing a better job, from mobilizing more energy, from serving their customers better, from collaborating more with their peers, whatever it may be. Have them observe that they have to experience it, and even sit down at the end of the day with these people and have a chat about, okay, what got in your way today? Most of them that actually did that were shocked after only a day or two to realize how much stuff actually gets in the way of people actually doing their work, and that's one way I can think of, and that I've seen work, provided again people will go along with that, because I had executives flat out refusing to do that, which also says something, I guess, about the organization. But anyway, Michele, the final word.
No, that's a great suggestion. And if they don't want to do that, then you're not serious. So let's stop pretending, right? No, you're right. So in a way, you have to hold up a mirror, and it has to be an experiential mirror so they really get it. I think, I do think that motivation is important, and motivation comes in a couple of ways. One, a couple flavors. One is like the moral case for this, like it's just plain wrong to treat people like shit in organizations, and it's wrong to have 15 people, pardon my French, 15 people engaged, as you showed. I mean, that's like outrageous, right? So we got to do better than that as a human, as a species, right? And and the other one is that is more pragmatic. Like if we don't change, there's a ton of drag in the organization that our accounting systems are not measuring. But we have, and you can go to our website, humanocracy.com. There's a little BMI tool, Bureaucracy Mass Index, that helps you quantify a little bit the drag that all these like old ways of doing work and organizing are creating, and it's a real cost that you can start to quantify it. And very, very quick example on this, Michelin, which we talk about in the book, they had that kind of two kind of stage realization. They're a very kind of Catholic company. They're headquartered in the heart of France, right? And so they thought like, and they were really worried about the blue collar workers not having a lot of autonomy and self-direction. So they thought like, are we losing our soul, like as a company? That's just like plain wrong. We can't treat people like that as tools, right? Because people have inherent worth, right? And then they also said, and by the way, all the Lean, Six Sigma, all that stuff that we tried, it's plateauing. So we need a new kind of horizon, right, of growth and productivity, and that will come from our people. So you could, but you need to kind of make this really crisp. And the more metrics you have to show the cost and the opportunity, the better. So I would start there, and then also then show there are different models, right? There are alternatives. And we can migrate to those models in a careful way. We can be radical in our aspirations, very practical in the way we get there. So motivation, models, and migration.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michele.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you. And again, sorry we're out of time. Thank you, Michele, specifically for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. That was fun. And with that, I also thank our audience to sort of bear with us for the amount of time that we spent. I hope you found some of it valuable and useful for your own practice. And with that, let me hand back to Paula for the final words.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Hello, thank you, Raymond. Thank you, Michele. I feel that everyone in the audience agrees that we could listen to you both for hours. So it's truly amazing to listen to your experience and learnings dealing with so many different companies in the world. Thank you so much for attending. This is our last webinar before the conference before the next World Agility Forum on Experience Agile. Thank you for joining us. And if you have any other questions that you want to address to our speakers or to the Experience Agile organization, please write to academy@agile2n.com. Thank you so much. See you in the next webinar, maybe after the conference, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.